know who's controlling the PowerPoint. I'm not.
No, it's Paul.
Oh, okay, yeah, so next slide. Okay. So Jim's just quickly going to go over some of our roles within the housing or the homelessness sector, and then I'm going to touch on some of our work in the housing sector.
Turn me places so I can see what's on the list first. Right. Yes, homelessness. So since 2012, we've been a third-party contractor for Service Canada, delivering funding to community organizations that provide support and services to the homeless and to those that are vulnerably or unstably housed. The program, we have a program here in Halifax and a separate one for the rest of Nova Scotia. Cape Breton Regional Municipality has its own, and there's also a separate Indigenous stream. Reaching Home is fairly substantial these past 2 years. So the rural program is every year, it's a little less than $1 million. In HRM, every year it's about 2.7 million. But during the 2 COVID years, 2021 and 21-22, we received substantial increases in our budget. So this over $5 million in total extra, and most of that money, well, most of it, all of it really went to primarily 2 initiatives. One was really to keep people off the streets and housed. So you've heard a lot of talk about folks in hotel rooms. A lot went to that. The other thing that at the back end of the kind of the sharp crisis curve, we've invested a fair amount in capital purchase so that going forward there will be housing and not just services. So there's a fair amount has gone to that, and there'll be an announcement, of kind of a formal announcement in 2 or 3 days about a significant purchase and what that's going to be used for. And I don't want to trump anybody, so that's all I'll say. Reaching Home in the program in Halifax has been given a different mandate this time around by Service Canada, and it has become much more outcome focused as opposed to activity focused. The outcome focused part is on the chronically homeless, those that have been homeless for a substantial period of time. And it's also dictating a methodology where it becomes a community response to homelessness as opposed to an agency response to homelessness. And coordinated access system is a system that has multiple entry points, but it's multiple entry points into one system, and then resources are applied through that system in 2 ways. One is a housing resource. So if there's a housing vacancy somewhere, that vacancy is reported to the system, and that vacancy is filled through the system on a priority basis. It's not filled by the agency that has the vacancy. And the same way with caseload support. If there's a caseload vacancy, that vacancy goes to the coordinated access system, and then somebody who is unsupported is then tied to the available support person, and so on. So it's quite different in terms of how community works and how they work together. And it's been a couple of years in the making. Officially, it'll start in April. So AHANS in its role is the coordinated access manager or coordinator. That's one of the roles. The other thing that Service Canada has really put an emphasis on is decisions based on data, and We use software called the Homeless Individuals and Families Information System, which is shortened to HIFAS. And HIFAS has many modules around housing placement, housing support, around client attributes, assessments, scales, lots of information. And HIFAS is countrywide, goes from Halifax to Victoria. All that information is at an aggregate level, not at a personal level, but at an aggregated level. All of that information is uploaded into Service Canada, who then do whatever they do with it, but it's fairly substantial. And then every couple of years we do what's called a point-in-time count, where we actually go out and at a given day, evening, overnight, actually count the number of homeless. Those point-in-time counts went by the wayside through COVID. They may be back next spring, they may not. It's hard to say. Amy? Yes. So the goal of Service Canada through Reaching Home is to reduce chronic homelessness by 50%. And if we flick to the next slide, actually, can we skip to 2 slides? Can we skip this one? Great. I don't know if you can see that. Oh, sorry, I missed. Oh, sorry, yes. 416 as of November the 16th. that we know about. That's how many we know about.
You've been given money for housing? Where is that housing going to be and when?
Well, that's 2 questions. No. So
I have an awful lot of questions because I know many people that are homeless, and $16 an hour is not giving them a place to live.
Right.
And mental health and addiction.
Yes.
They are homeless. I know that for sure. Lots of the people I meet. What is there going to be done for them?
That's a very good question. I don't know if that's a housing or a homeless question, because in this case, they kind of go together. So the money that we have from Service Canada to invest is not invested in individuals. It's invested in service providers to support individuals, and it can be invested in housing. But it's not invested in individuals where they would get like a regular income. It can do a couple of things. If someone is unable to find housing because they have a power bill arrears, say they can't get power, we'll pay that off. Or if it's a rental arrears problem, we'll pay that off. Or we may be able to do a damage deposit, or we may pay for 1 year's tenant's insurance. But the resources we have don't go directly to the homeless. They go to support the homeless or to support service agencies that work with the homeless.
We have a question from online as well.
Okay.
Will the slides be available after this? And the second is, has Service Canada indicated why they favor community response versus agency response?
maybe I wasn't clear. We fund agencies. So we fund Shelter Nova Scotia, Edson for Women and Children, Salvation Army. We fund Eve Fry Society. We fund Coverdale. We fund Welcome Housing. We fund the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Society. Our money goes to those agencies that support a clientele. That's who we fund. And the agencies support, Edson supports women and children. YW supports women. Shelter Nova Scotia supports, Salvation Army primarily support men. Coverdale supports women involved in the justice system. John Howard men involved with the justice system. So we fund them to support their clients. I don't want you to lose that question about the $16 an hour, because I'd like to talk about that a little bit when we talk about the housing part. So we'll come back and I'll speak to that question where $16 an hour is not enough, and we'll come back to that. That's an important point. So this is just a quick look at the numbers, and I need to get closer so that I can see them. So as of last week, we had 416 people that we knew about who were actively homeless. So they were in a shelter or they were unsheltered. Slightly more men than women. About 2/3 are men, 1/3 are women. 75% of them are chronic. And what chronically homeless means, you've been homeless for 6 months or more. Or you've been, over a 3-year span, you've been homeless for a year or more. So 3/4 of the homeless individuals are chronically homeless.
Can I borrow that for a second?
The other thing that is important to note is a large proportion of those homeless individuals are tri or comorbid. And that's a term that speaks to their mental health or addiction or chronic health. And tri-COVID is you have all three of those things. Comorbidity is you have at least 2 of them. So the population that is the population that Service Canada would like its funding to be invested in ending their homelessness is specifically that population. It's the chronically homeless. It's the individuals that have trouble finding and sustaining housing through their own personal issues.
Just a question for clarification on some of those numbers there. I would imagine people could fall into multiple categories.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, I noticed that. B&L stands for the by name list. So when I spoke earlier about coordinated access, and I said where someone is identified by homeless and they're referred to the the coordinated access system, the system creates a by name list, a person's name. So that at that top where it says 416 active homeless, we know their names. We know their names. We also, by and large, know where they are. So we know where they are, and by and large, they have some sort of support. There is a number that are not connected to anybody. Part of that comes from, how would I phrase this? They're not ready to be connected, I would say, is part of it. The other part of it is kind of the resource load in terms of how many can one housing support worker actually work with at a time. So part of that, when I spoke earlier about caseload vacancies, we would go to the by name list, and whoever was more or less the top of that list would then be, that person would go on into the caseload vacancy. I say more or less at the top of the list because we probably would not ask the Salvation Army to support a female. That's a really good example.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, they don't normally work with women. Well, their support staff don't work with, they work with males.
Can you clarify the Salvation Army doesn't work with?
Right. So,
Yeah, the question.
So if the top of the list was a female and they had the vacancy.
Yeah, so the question, just one quick thing here, just because there is a decent size, probably same size audience online, and they definitely can't hear the questions unless they come through the mic. So we're totally happy that people, I think this is what you're looking for, is the back and forth interaction. Just maybe you could kindly just raise your hand. I could come over, pass the mic to you, and then you could just ask your question into the mic. That way the people online can also hear.
So one of the things I would say about the impact that COVID had over the past 2 years is that the number of absolute homeless at any one time, that number at the top of 416, that number has gone up. There's no question about that. The number of trying comorbid individuals and the number of chronically homeless, more than 6 months, those numbers have grown. And they've grown, I think, more, that speaks more to the lack of housing than it does necessarily to anything else. It's we can't house people, and then more people kind of, what I would say is age into chronic homelessness. If you can't find a host, eventually you're 6 months homeless and suddenly you're chronically homeless. But the impact of COVID really is around the absolute numbers. And that speaks to the housing crisis more so than anything else. Yeah. So that's the kind of the work that we do around homeless, and so we don't work directly with the homeless population, but we work very closely with service agencies that do, and take their advice in terms of what sorts of investments we need to be making in order to make those numbers start to go down. So, question with the mic.
I understand. I understand that COVID has, negatively affected all aspects of sort of humanity. But when you say that COVID has really made, sort of a major impact on the housing issue, I've lived in this city in 38 years, and there's been a housing issue that's been escalating terribly long before COVID. And so I'm just personally curious how much of an impact COVID has made and how. Like, I know it's impacted everything, but on housing in particular.
Oh yeah, I don't need that.
Yeah.
So it's COVID, and this we'll go back to 2020. We'll go back to the lockdown. What the lockdown did, and the introduction of COVID into our society, broke down a lot of informal arrangements. So where people were couch surfing in somebody else's apartment, that relationship, because of lockdown, started not to work. So they left. Folks with temporary service industry jobs that were contributing in some other household to the rent who lost their work or left, or sometimes CERB took them out, and then they couldn't find housing and couldn't get back in. So there's more than one way in which that happened, but those are the kinds of dynamics. Landlords could afford to become more choosy too, in terms, if they had a vacancy, they could wait and look and wait and look. So it's, your point though about the housing crisis growing is absolutely true, and it's a good segue into me stop talking and let Adrian talk.
I'm just going to quickly go back to the second slide, just so I can go over some of AHANS' activities in the housing sector. Perfect. So around 2018, 2019, AHANS started to evolve from just acting within the homelessness sector to getting more involved in permanent affordable housing. So in 2018, we purchased our first building. We've been able to grow that stock. So we now own 4 buildings with just over 95 units or individual rooms and rooming houses. We've also been able to secure land. Oh, sorry, I think it's the next slide. The one before that, like the second slide in the PowerPoint. Yeah, perfect. We've also been able to secure land from the city. So the city has a community interest surplus category where they designate land for nonprofits. And we were lucky enough to get 4 pieces of property in Dartmouth. So we're now doing the preliminary work and some of the pre-financing work to try and get a development off the ground to build multi-residential units. No.
I'm very, very strongly about this. You say there's some properties that you have, and how much are they going to be as a rent?
So so our properties' rents are geared differently. So it depends what they're funded through. So we have some properties that are geared towards income. So we try and do 30% of a tenant's income. So what we always do is we look at the market rent, and then we try and just subtract and do a below market rent based on the folks that we're housing. So some apartments we can charge a bit more because the folks are working, they're not on income assistance. Some apartments are rent geared to income. Some we work directly with the province and just get transfers from the province for the rent, and the tenant just pays a portion of it.
And when will they be ready?
They're ready. They're renting right now. So
they are?
The only property that isn't renting is the property that Jim alluded to that we just purchased. So it's being converted right now. It wasn't traditionally residential. So those units just aren't ready, but every other building that we have is full.
I'm sorry, so some are renting right now?
Yeah, they're all renting right now.
And how much is that rent that you're renting right now?
So they're they're different, but like
approximately, if you're earning $15 an hour, how much would they be spending on that?
Most of our rents are around $650.
Pardon me?
$650 a month.
And they're going to be able to afford that, you think? On $15 an hour?
They also have housing subsidy on top of that.
It's very, very difficult to find an apartment. Very, very difficult, and particularly at that amount.
I agree with that. I want to go back to the $650. That's what the tenant is paying. That's not right. There's also housing subsidies involved.
So they're going to pay less then, you're saying?
They pay the standard 30% of their income. That's whatever their income is. So the rent could be as low as $400, or it could be high as $800. It's all income based.
Okay, $400. Because weren't they going to give the developers some money to build some housing?
That's a question.
And that might be $400 an apartment or something. Is that what I heard or read?
So there was a program, it was called density bonusing, that the city put out, and originally what was going to happen were developers were going to build affordable housing units within their development. The city had then changed its mind, and now there's a fund. So whenever a developer wants to get the density bonusing in their buildings, they want to build higher, they contribute money to a fund, and the city has just laid out the parameters of how that fund will be redistributed to nonprofits. So there's now a program that nonprofits can apply to get capital financing to build or to renovate a unit.
Because talking about the Salvation Army, people that work there only get $15 an hour too, and that's a very difficult job to do. And there's a lot of men, they lie in the cots at night, and there's a lot of them that there's no cots for them. So it's not an easy life. It's not an easy life for them at all. And I have to say, yes, some of them have mental health or addiction. So that's why if there was a place that was built that had small little apartments, but they had a social worker or something like that in the building, that might be, I think.
Yeah, so that's
positive.
considered a shared housing model, which the city's trying to encourage, and that's what some of our buildings are based around. So it's like a wraparound approach. So most of our tenants that we take come with housing support workers. So they come with an attachment to a support worker who can help them with some of those social challenges that they may face. So we offer the housing, and we partner with social agencies to offer the social services, because we don't have social services within AHANS. So we partner with ADSM or Shelter Nova Scotia to kind of have those wraparound services for our tenants. No problem. So the next is for consultancy. So we've had the opportunity to work with a number of nonprofits who want to expand their housing stock. So we've helped them through planning applications, we've done project management with them, we've helped do growth assessments to kind of get nonprofits thinking about how do we expand our stock and what opportunities exist to develop new housing to help house the folks who need housing. We do property management for all of our buildings, but we've also worked with a few private developers who are looking to offer affordable housing but want the support from a nonprofit to understand kind of what are the extra things you need to think about. So we've been able to do that. And then just from a research standpoint, we've done some neighborhood studies looking at neighborhoods that have valuable affordable housing stock and what threats may exist, but also what opportunities exist to expand the stock in those neighborhoods around HRM. We've also looked at different areas of the province, so all of that research can be found on our website. I'm going to skip ahead now to a few
Adrian,
slides ahead.
Adrian, could you just maybe tell folks when you say the stock of affordable housing units in the city, what are we talking about? How many are we talking about? Like when you say the stock.
Right, yeah. So not many. In HRM, there's about 400 units that are managed by about 18 agencies. So I'll get to this, but I'll answer the question now, I guess. Like basically, HRM or Halifax has a lot of nonprofits that have a very small stock. So they might have 12 units, they might have 20 units, they might have 40 units, and they're not achieving the economies of scale that we're seeing in other provinces where there's nonprofit housing developers who have 100 units or 200 units, and they're able to kind of leverage their assets and essentially act like developers. So because our service providers are so strapped, because they're offering healthcare services, they're offering housing support workers, they're offering employment services, and they're offering housing, a lot of our nonprofits don't have the mindset or the capacity to think, oh, and I'm also going to develop housing, because their staff is so under-resourced. They're already pulled in so many directions because there's so many community needs. And so we don't have that mindset of how do we continue to grow our stock. And so we're in this crisis now with housing, and we don't have a nonprofit sector that can respond to it.
Yeah, this might be a good opportunity to ask for clarification. I feel like you're taking a lot of heat for all the problems that we have with affordable housing, but correct me if I'm wrong. AHANS is one of many nonprofit organizations. You're managing a certain number of buildings, but AHANS is not responsible for everything related to affordable housing and in those.
Yeah, we're not the government.
Yeah.
And you aren't. Are you the largest even, or
No.
not even the largest? So you're coming to us tonight with your experience. You're probably as frustrated as anyone is trying to deal with a big problem with limited resources.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name, and I don't like to. I'm looking right at you, and I don't. Yes, you. No, the lady behind you. No, you put your finger on the source of the problem when you spoke, because what you said was the government has ignored this for 30 years, and you're absolutely correct. That's a huge piece
I
of
do agree.
how we got to where we are today. That's not the only piece, but that's a very, very big piece of why we're in the mess we're in right now.
I wanted to just touch on something quickly because it was just briefly mentioned, slightly mentioned, the aspect of private owners getting remotely involved, should they be interested in getting involved in affordable housing, and to what extent that happens. I mean, to what extent you're aware of it happening, and to what extent there might be some incentive, and I don't mean a huge capitalist sort of heap of money necessarily, but some incentive to invite and encourage.
We might give you two different perspectives on that. I'm a bit of a hardliner. The private sector, residential property developers, their goal is to make money. And there's two ways in which they make money. One is they make money through cash flow. That's one way. They make money through a profit. So they have revenue, they have expenses, and and that the difference is their profit, and they look for a rate of return on the money they've invested to put the stock in place in the first place. But their goal is to make money. The other way to make money is through capturing the capital, the equity in your property. So, and many small landlords, that's exactly why they're in the game. So they would have a 10-unit building. They would keep a 10-unit building for 15 years, 20 years, and then they sell it. And they just take the increased value out, and it goes in their pocket. So when you speak about private sector involvement in building affordable housing, what you have to realize is that their interest in affordable housing is going to be time limited. And it's going to be time limited because at some point they're going to want to stop. And they're going to want to stop because either they've taken enough money out through cash flow and they don't want to reinvest. It's time to do the windows, it's time to do the roof, it's time to repaint, it's time for all new, they don't want to do that anymore, so they stick a for sale sign on it, and then someone else comes along, they have to do all that work, and the rent goes up. So whatever incentive there is for the private sector, people have to keep in mind, there's a horizon. At some point, that's going to stop. The thing with nonprofit housing is non-profit. Doesn't mean no surplus, it just means no profit, and it's non-profit forever. And there's a very, very big difference in the philosophy of how those two sectors work, because the nonprofit sector is in it for the long term, the very long term. The private developer, not so much. No disrespect to any private developer that's with us tonight. Yeah, but Adrian?
I won't do this again. I raised my family in a housing co-op, which CMA
There's a question online.
Paul, there's a question online.
Oh, we can't hear anything on Zoom, somehow Paul got muted, but I'm hoping that you can hear me and I'll ask my questions now, okay? Where are the municipal governments changing the bylaws, building rules? Are there non-my backyard groups that are hanging around in the waiting, ready to shut that down? And are there other problematic hoops that have to be jumped through? And then I have a different set of questions from someone.
I think there's part of the question I missed. But I can tell you, I can answer part of the question I heard. I can answer. So,
Paul, they can't hear online.
oh. Sure. Sorry. 1, 2, 3 test.
They can't hear online.
Could you maybe ask them to repeat the question too? I didn't quite hear everything. I don't think you did.
Annika, while we're figuring that out, can you repeat your questions? Can you hear me? No.
Not hear you either.
Annika, while we figure that out, can you repeat your questions?
Sure. Where are municipal governments changing bylaws and the building rules around those? Are there not my backyard groups waiting to shut them down? And are there problematic groups that need to be jumped through other than just the not my backyard groups? And then I have a whole other set of questions that are for a different topic.
Yeah, okay, so can you hear me now? We're good, okay. So AHANS was fortunate to be invited to have a table at the Nova Scotia Affordable Housing Commission that started work last December, made 17 recommendations to the province at the end of May. One of those recommendations, which the province is acting on, is to change the Municipal Government Act to allow municipalities to play as active a role in affordable housing as they wish to. It is still a provincial responsibility, but they're trying through the Municipal Government Act to take away some of the restrictions that municipalities are saddled with. For instance, municipalities cannot own affordable housing unless it's a residential care facility. So just ordinary rental housing, they're barred from owning. They cannot, there are restrictions on what they can do with land and a private developer. So they're trying to take some of these things away so that those municipalities who want to be active will be able to be active. I can't answer the question about what municipalities will do to fight backlash against secondary suites and inclusionary zoning, so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, with NIMBYism, I feel like you're always going to encounter that to an extent. The city, I can speak to HRM, I don't know if anyone here was involved in the center plan and that getting approved. It just got approved last week. It's been about 6 or 7 years that they've been trying to approve it, but there's a lot more in those land use bylaws that focus around different forms of housing that can be tailored or geared towards folks who might need more support. So there's new bylaws for shared housing, there's new bylaws for secondary suites, there's new bylaws for backyard suites, and those are all approaches to try and increase the supply, but increase the supply of housing in a way that it will increase affordable housing specifically. So HRM is taking steps towards doing that, but like Jim said, it's their hands are tied in a lot of situations because the Municipal Government Act doesn't allow them to do as much as they'd like.
But it won't make them do housing. We are working currently with a municipality who's willing to do whatever it possibly can to help us put affordable housing in their municipality. We know another municipality where the council in seat CEO can't wait for these changes to happen because they want to establish a municipal nonprofit that can do affordable housing. Anxious to get going. Lunenburg, the town of Lunenburg, has just taken almost all its restrictions out, so that all those things that we talk about around inclusionary zoning and backyard suites, you can do those now in the town of Lunenburg. But as I say that, and I won't name names, but I know 2 municipalities that aren't going to do a damn thing because they don't want to. It's not their job. They're not interested. So it very much is a mixed bag around that part of it. Yeah.
Okay, so the second question is, why or how can we learn from other countries who have success in this area around micro housing, or tiny homes, and tiny villages, those self-contained communities?
Well, I think maybe I'm going to stop talking. You answer the question.
So from our experience, I can only speak from our experience, we've been working with some construction companies and some builders who are starting to look at different ways of building homes that are save costs so that you can make them more affordable, as well as trying to build as energy efficient as possible, because although like it's amazing for the environment, but it also makes a huge difference in your operational costs. Just kind of what Jim, I think, was getting at was if your costs continue to go up, and costs are kind of out of our hands, if our insurance is going up, if utilities is going up, if labor to come get repairs in the unit is going up, landlords, whether you're a nonprofit or a private developer, have to charge higher rents just to cover your costs. So looking towards more energy efficient approaches will help bring those costs down in the hopes of being able to charge less rent, and it's just better for the environment. But looking at different ways to build, I think we see as a solution forward as to how to reduce our construction costs, create more efficient homes, and be able to reduce rents in the long term. So that's one of the solutions, or one of the ways that we're looking at it.
We'll do that in 1 second.
Are you done with your question?
No, I got one more, and then I see another one coming in. So I'll do this one, and then you can take one from the room in there. If a big community has land that can be used for housing, what should they do?
I think there's a couple different approaches. You could look to a nonprofit that your faith community feels like they have common interests or common values with, and approach them to see if there's any solutions, or if the nonprofit has an ability to partner with them. Approaching the city is also another option. Like you could go and get a meeting with a planner at a city and kind of look at like what's possible in our land, because a lot of what can be done depends on the zoning. So kind of getting a good understanding of what's actually possible on the land will then kind of direct your group towards who you might want to approach. Another opportunity that we've been looking more and more to is the private sector isn't bad. Like they have a lot of good resources. They're really good at what they do. And there are a lot of private developers and landlords out there who want to build affordable housing. They just don't know how. So we have a bunch who knock on our doors all the time asking, how do we build affordable housing? Who can we partner with? They have the expertise on the building side, and they're just looking for an opportunity to build with a nonprofit or figure out how to do that. So having land or being able to partner with a private developer, I feel like the media sometimes tries to make them seem awful, but I do think there's a lot of really socially conscious developers out there who have the expertise and just want to have an opportunity to partner.
I just would like to check in with our guests here. We're sort of slipping into Q&A already, and I'm not sure if you have finished your presentation, because we are sort of hijacking your presentation right now. I would like to offer our guests an opportunity to finish the presentation, and unless you have a very direct question that relates directly to what they say, hold on to your questions until we go into the Q&A.
Yeah, okay.
Okay? Thank you.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's just 3 more, and I feel like some of the slides might answer some of the questions that are coming up, so maybe we'll just breeze through them and then answer the questions that are left. So if we keep going, I I don't know which number it is, but
7.
oh, the one back.
What does untethered mean?
They're not, we don't know how to find them. We have their name, but we don't know where they are.
Okay, so Jim kind of stole my thunder on this one, but basically the context of affordable housing right now, as Jim said, is not a today's problem. It's from decades of unplanned housing and decades of kind of lack of provincial or regional housing strategies that's led to where we were. So it would be really easy if we could look back and say it was this government who did it, or it was this decision, or it was this policy that caused the problem, but it's really decades of kind of laissez-faire development. We've wanted development for a long time, and so we've allowed it to happen as the developer wanted to happen. There's been no plan. And so we haven't been like looking at our demographics or projecting where are demographics going, what will they need, or where is our economy going, what kind of housing do we need to support that? And because of that, we're kind of in this position right now. So there's a lot of variables that go into it, but some of them that, from our perspective, we talk about a lot at work so I'll just go through the list really quickly. So government reliance on the private sector. So since the 1980s, most government programs have focused on fostering affordable housing in the private market. There haven't been a lot of programs that have encouraged nonprofit development. And the issue with that, and Jim kind of touched on this, is a lot of the programs fund a unit in the private sector for an agreement period of time, so maybe 10 years or 20 years, and it's kind of a Band-Aid solution because that unit doesn't stay affordable. Once the agreement's over, the landlord normally increases the rent to make up for the cost that they left. So it's more of a Band-Aid solution. It's not a long-term solution of how are we fostering an affordable housing sector. Another program that's been really popular for decades is the rent supplement program. So a household can go to the province, apply for a rent supplement, go get a unit in the private market. So their income pays a certain amount, and then the rent supplement tops it up. So when our vacancy rate was quite healthy, like 4 and 5%, that program worked really well because landlords wanted tenants. So they were more willing to work with this program. But now that we're seeing such a shortage of supply and landlords are getting 15 to 20 applications for one unit, they're more likely to go with the tenant who doesn't come with the strings of a rent supplement. They're going to accept a tenant who can just pay the rent. So that program isn't working right now because there's tons of rent supplements that are available to tenants, but they can't find units to use them in. So this is all from years of the government focusing on the private sector and not trying to build up the nonprofit housing sector. Another element that's worth talking about is called naturally occurring affordable housing units. So in any given housing market, you have the newest housing that's built, and that's the most expensive. You have the units that are about 10 to 20 years old, and they're kind of middle. And then you have the units that are the oldest, maybe 40 years old, and they're just naturally the most affordable because they're the least desirable to live in. They're not as new. And so those units for us right now were mostly built in the 1970s and 80s. So there was a housing boom at that point. There was a bunch of money from CMHC to build housing all over the country. And so we built a lot in Halifax during that period of time. And now those units are getting to their maturity date. So today, they're 40, they're 50 years old, and they need to be redeveloped, they need to be renovated. And so we're seeing those units either be renovated and the rents go up, or they're being demolished and there's something being rebuilt, but there's not a housing stock to replace those naturally occurring affordable housing units because not as much was built in the 80s and 90s. So just our supply isn't consistent, and we don't have units in the private market to replace those units that are evaporating. So we're just seeing a lack of supply in the private market as well. This is kind of tied to the first one, a lack of capacity in the nonprofit housing sector. So unlike other provinces that created programs that kind of fostered building capacity in the nonprofit housing sector, so you can look to BC, you can look to Quebec, you can look to Ontario, they all did a really good job. We didn't do that. And so we have a nonprofit housing sector that for decades hasn't been receiving the funding that they need and hasn't built the capacity that they needed to now respond to the crisis that's going on. So when we talk about expansion, buying land, buying a building, developing, they don't have the capacity to do that at this time. And it's due to lack of decades of not supporting them the way they should have been supported. This goes right to the point we've been talking about, stagnant income. We can talk about affordable housing as much as we want, and supply can make a difference to an extent. But if incomes don't increase, there's always going to be that gap between the cost to actually just run a unit and someone's income to live there. And nonprofits for decades have been trying to internally subsidize and offer really low rents and run a deficit because they're not covering their costs. And so we're having a lot of nonprofits now who've been running deficits for decades because they're offering rent, like they're losing money and they're not getting topped up by the government. We touched on this, but rising property costs, so the cost just associated to operate a unit has gone up dramatically. So again, whether you're a private developer or a nonprofit, those costs are they're uncontrollable. We don't have control over the cost of utilities, over the cost to build a unit. And so we're always trying to balance how much can we charge in rent, but how much are our bills? And then the last is just population. We have experienced a population rise. HRM has been growing at a rate of about 3.5 to 4% a year. COVID has changed that a bit, but I expect it to keep growing, which is good. We've been trying to attract development, but there's just a supply issue of too many people applying for too few units. And what's being built right now isn't exactly matching what folks need. So yeah, those are just some of the factors that we think contribute to the context. There's more, and there's more to it that we probably don't understand, but it's kind of what we're seeing in the context today. And I'll just go quickly to the next slide. So in our role as the Affordable Housing Association and our opportunity to work with other nonprofits, we've come up with, there's common barriers that nonprofits experience when they're talking about expanding their stock. So again, small scale portfolios, a lot of nonprofits don't have that many units. They also offer an array of other resources to tenants. And so their primary mandate isn't always to develop housing. It's housing with caseworkers, with employment services, with health benefits. So they're doing all those things, and housing isn't always their priority, and they don't always have the capacity to leverage assets to continue developing. Low rental revenue and increasing operational costs. Like I said, nonprofits are constantly battling against this deficit of trying to offer the lowest rents possible, but trying to balance their budgets. And a lot of nonprofits end up getting into trouble because their mandate, and it's what they want to do, is offer units to the most vulnerable in our population, but those folks aren't earning enough to pay a higher rent. An aging housing stock, so a lot of nonprofits have housing from the 70s and 80s, which has made it incredibly difficult to renovate or to bring up to different standards for energy efficiency or accessibility, and they're getting to the end of their lifespan where they need major renovations, and nonprofits don't necessarily have that reserve stock to replace those things. And most nonprofits, although they were contributing to reserves, had to dip into the reserves sooner rather than later because of the deficit they are running. So now when nonprofits need a new roof or they need a huge structural improvement, they don't have those capital replacement reserves to cover it, which has kind of led to where they are.
That's when they start selling.
Yes, we see them start to sell. The housing can fall into disrepair. There's nonprofits with units that are just boarded up because they're inhabitable.
And as Adrian said, they've also kept the rents low, so they don't have the rental income to actually pay a loan back that normally that's what would happen. So they can't do either. They don't have the cash, but they don't generate enough revenue to actually go to the bank and get a mortgage because they don't have the revenue to pay it back.
Mm-hmm. And I already touched on lack of capacity, but the last is just available land. Like in the regional center right now, land is very difficult to come by. It's very expensive. And nonprofits don't really have the ability to act in the private market and compete against private developers to access land. And so what you're seeing is maybe a nonprofit who's typically active in the north end of Halifax, where most of their demographic is from. That's where they're most comfortable in. They have access to bus lines, they have access to services, but the only available land is out in maybe Cole Harbour or out near Sackville. And so it doesn't really make sense for them to try and get land out there, but it's the only land that is available at this time. So those are kind of all contributing factors to why some nonprofits are struggling to increase their housing stock. So although they acknowledge there's a housing crisis, there's a lot of barriers in front of them to respond to it and increase the number of units that they have.
So I just wanted to very quickly touch on the two different aspects of this. So one is affordable housing. And when we talk about affordable housing, Adrian and I, we talk about housing that rents at kind of below market, and it's available for rent at much lower rents. That's affordable housing. And we have an affordable housing crisis. We don't have enough of it. The other aspect of this is housing affordability. But by that I mean a household's ability to pay the rent. And in Nova Scotia, there is so much pressure on moderate and low incomes because wage rate is low, as you've pointed out. Taxes are high, fuel costs are high, childcare costs are high, food is high. All of those other things that you need, low-income households are forced to choose between a range of, and I forgot high taxes. They're forced to choose between some of those things and rent. I mean, that's the kind of conundrum that they're in. So the housing affordability, there's a group in Ontario called Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis. I think it's a fancy name. And I think it was in 2018, maybe 17, in that time frame. They did a study on housing affordability and looked at this aspect of housing for moderate incomes. And Nova Scotia was the worst place in the country. We were the worst. And we were the worst in those pressures. All of those combined pressures made us essentially the worst place to be trying to find a place to live. If you have modest income and you're renting, don't come to Nova Scotia. So I'm really curious to see what the impact of $10 a day childcare will have, because I'm not sure. We do housing, that's all we think about, what impacts housing, what doesn't. But if you have $10 a day daycare, that will start to take stress off your household income in terms of the other things you have to pay for. I think it potentially to have a huge impact for particularly young families trying to get a go where they're sort of not middle-aged making tons of money. So we have both those issues here. We have it's a perfect storm. We have it all. We have the high pressure on our incomes, and we have a lack of places that are affordable to start with. So it's it's a deep hole.
You had a question?
You have a question?
Is it AHANS? Okay.
Yes, so yes, we're connected.
Yeah.
We own it,
Okay. And
to be blunt. In the plan that the facility, the housing will be for the most vulnerable. It'll be for those trying comorbid. There will be clinical supports available
Yeah.
for them. When I say clinical, I mean nursing, doctors,
Yeah.
OT workers, mental health workers, addiction workers, those
Yeah.
kinds of skills will all be available. So that part is absolutely true. And really quite excited about that, really. And where our partners are the North End Community
Right.
Health Center in that work. So we will do the nuts and bolts of the building, and they will do the service provision to the residents. So yes, we are connected intimately. The first part of your question about soon, there's work to be done before it's ready for occupancy.
When the media gets a hold of things, they make it sound like, oh, it's going to happen next week. Or
Well, I can guarantee you it's not going to happen
Right.
next week. I don't know if any of you are connected in any way to the building industry, but I don't think we've ever seen anything like this. You can't find supplies, you can't find
Right.
people to work. And we are very fortunate in the working relationship we have developed with Dora Construction, and we are really leaning on them and their supply chain to help us get this done as fast as we can.
Thanks.
You get a question?
It's in Dartmouth. It's by the Dartmouth side of the new bridge, sorry, and just behind the U-Haul. If you know where Shannon Park used to be, so this is on the hill above, and it looks out towards the harbor, just by Shannon Park. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Question in the back? Yeah.
So I'm not actually sure what it's called, but right now there's actually an open call for nonprofits who have units that they either want to build or they want to renovate. So it would have to be a unit that's in kind of disrepair. They can apply for funding that would come from that pool of money. So right now there's a cap of $200,000 that a nonprofit can apply for, and they have to have submissions, I think, in by December 31st, and that will be the first round of money from that pool that will be reinvested into the community housing sector.
Okay, and so what about small?
So, there would be no government help on the purchase of an existing building, but
Or even the investment, I mean, like.
but there potentially would be help on the renovation. So Housing Nova Scotia has a program called Residential Rehabilitation Program, and they would advance money for repairs, so roofs, windows, those kinds of capital repairs in a building, and then in return for affordable rents, that would be forgiven over time. But I'll go back to what I said earlier about the key thing is over time, because when the time runs out, then those obligations have been fulfilled and the landlord can do whatever they like with the rent. But to your point, they do have that program called RAP, R-A-P. So they would be eligible to apply for that.
And then in terms of the operational cost,
How many public housing units are there?
There's 12, there's just shy of 12,000 across the province, and
But I
in
think
HRM
there's
there's
4,000.
4,000, 4,200
But
maybe.
between 4,000 and 5,000 in
Yeah.
HRM.
Yeah.
4 or 5,000 public housing units in the city, and then the stock from nonprofit housing is,
300?
you said about 400.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the stock of co-ops is just over 1,000.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. There's more than one program. Some are attached to units and some are attached to people.
Yeah. So developers or landlords can apply and get a rent supplement for their unit, and so it's attached to that. But an individual can also apply and get a rent supplement, and it's portable, which is a lot more liberating for that individual because then they can choose to live where they want. They're not attached to a unit because the rent supplement's there. So the portable ones are much better for individuals, whereas landlords who want to supply affordable housing can get a rent sub for their unit.
Okay, and there's one in the back too.
And there's one.
That was, they were.
Let's do some online, and then we'll come over to you.
Okay, we've got two for the online. Someone brings up an example of Reverend Christopher White, who was featured in Broadview Magazine, and he notes that they are partnering with a very exciting and innovative program to sponsor homeless folks, much the same way we do refugee sponsorship. Has this approach been tried here?
No.
Yeah, no, I've never heard.
And the second question might be related then. What are the best ways for faith communities like ours to support the housing insecure?
It's a good question. I'm not, I've had this conversation in my own parish, which is in downtown Dartmouth. And it's a difficult one to answer because many folks who are homeless come with a wide variety of issues, active addictions and mental health, and to interact with those folks on a regular basis, you need to have some training and some skills. And I am very nervous of volunteer organizations that run shelters or run drop-ins because their hearts are in the right place, but I am concerned for their safety, frankly, because if one of those individuals is off their meds or can't get their fix or whatever is pushing their buttons on a particular day, the outcome may not be very pretty. So I do really and truly worry about that. When I say that, what I've encouraged our parish to do is to start slowly around the food bank. That one of the things that they might do is invite one of the service providers, housing support workers, to come to Thursday morning food bank for a while. First of all, to see who's turning up at our food bank who's actually homeless. Some are, most are not. They're just precariously housed and need the food. It's not that they're homeless, but there are some who are, and that's a way to kind of start. I mean, to be frank with you, sometimes, and I'm not a social worker, so everything that I'm saying to you, I've learned from working with social workers over the past 10 years. Not everybody wants your help. And sometimes that's not easy for people to accept. They may want your money, but they may not want your help. They may not think they need help. They resist if they think you're trying to live their life or something. Like it's the dynamic is a difficult one to deal with. That's what I would say. You know, as a parish, I just think if you're thinking about it, you should have that part of the conversation as well about the risks involved, and I think you should find a way to reach out to service providers to have a conversation with them in terms of what you might expect or what you might not expect, so that if you start down that road, start with baby steps and start with your eyes wide open is what I would say. It may not be what you want to hear, but that's what I would say. There's late.
Yeah.
I guess just. Where to go?
We also have been thinking about that in a kind of a different way, but kind of along the same lines. So it's very hard for a nonprofit to be a charity, a nonprofit housing provider to be a charity, because CRA requires a housing charity to rent 100% of their units to very low income. And we know from 40 years of experience that over time that's not sustainable. You can't maintain your units if you don't generate enough rent. So what we've been thinking about is there a way for a charitable foundation to potentially rent units at market from the nonprofits and then sublet them have the nonprofit sublet them at lower rents to the occupant is one way. The other way is simply to have the charitable organization pay the nonprofit directly for part of the rent. The challenge with both of them is you potentially set up the tenant, and then if the charity fails, then the tenant is the loser. And so there's some ethical questions to answer around that, and would a charity really want to operate in that model? But CERB did a lot of damage too. The $2,000 that the government freely handed out to everybody who asked for it during the first lockdown, ended up with all kinds of people cut off of EI and then lost their CERB and lost their income. Then they had nothing. And hence some of those numbers. Anyway, you have a question.
I was thinking about some of the subsidies that I've been interacting with people.
Well, I do know. So some groups, the faith-based groups, but also just like other community groups, reach out to service providers who have tenants who have arrears, and so they make a one-time payment of the arrear. So let's say we have a tenant who's been unable to pay our rent. They have arrears of $400. The group will pay us directly to pay off their arrears. So it's a one-time payment. There's no false hope in the sense of it's ongoing, but it might just help someone who's in between jobs or who has been in a precarious situation, has been unable to pay rent, just gets them back on their feet to a point where they're still housed and can continue to try and make a housing plan to stay housed. So it's a one-time payment, and it goes right from the group to the property owner.
I think that's really awesome. And it is what churches can offer. And around electrical bills, too.
Yeah, electrical bills, like we've seen that too. So the way that gets facilitated is through the housing support workers. So ADSM, Shelter Nova Scotia, Salvation Army, all of their tenants are housed in the nonprofit and the public and the private market. And they have tenants who have arrears. And so when there's no money through diversion funding, through the government or through AHANS, they will look out to either faith-based or just community groups who have that pot of money, who are willing to pay like the $80 for a power bill or the $100 for arrears or $300 for a damage deposit to get someone in a unit. So they're one-time payments, but they can make a huge difference for someone to either stay housed or to get into housing.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's 8:30.
Workers, they start to learn like where funds are. So if one of the faith-based communities here wanted to set something up, they would know like this is a possible opportunity. We can reach out to them and say, you know, we have this tenant who needs X amount of money to stay housed or to get into their unit. So it just becomes kind of like community knowledge among the housing support workers of who has these funds. And some of them have like formal application processes, or some of them they just call, but they can really make a huge difference.
The one really good thing about them is they can be very quick. Like they can turn around very, very quickly, like in a day, which is faster than we can move, and certainly faster than government moves, for sure.
I think we just have one last question that we're going to take from the online audience, and then I think we're going to sort of bring the evening to a close, and I think Norm is going to wrap it up. So we'll go to the online.
There are two of us with pretty much the exact same question. Are there advocacy options that might better assist the housing insecure than direct financial support?
One of the things the Premier said, not too, maybe 8 weeks ago now, time flies fast. I have never heard an elected official say out loud before. And what he said when he was announcing the new government's response to the Affordable Housing Commission's recommendations, he said that health outcomes are directly related to housing. And that is so true. It is so true. I've seen research from the States where high incomes in bad housing have worse outcomes than low income in good housing. Housing is pivotal to your mental health and your physical health and your family's health and everything. I would suggest that we don't let anybody forget that that's what he said out loud, and that we remind all of our elected officials that he said that out loud, municipal and provincial, and that we keep their feet in the fire and make them deliver on those words, and not just make it a speech, but make them deliver. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I think too, like if there's a group who wants to do something non-financial, like the best thing would be to reach out to a service provider that you feel like you want to partner with and see what they think they need, because they work directly with these folks every day who are experiencing homelessness, and would probably have ideas of non-financial supports that can be contributed that could make a big difference. So it would be partnering with those agencies who work directly with them to figure, okay, we don't want to go the financial route, but we have these resources, or we have this time, or we have different resources that we can offer, and seeing how you can pair it up that way.
We're easy to find, and we like to talk. So if you have a question tomorrow that you didn't ask today, please don't be shy and reach out. You can find us at info@ahans.ca. It's pretty simple. So thank you.
This is yours. That's mine.
Officially.
No.
Testing. Oh, that's better. So I just wanted to officially thank you for being here. I'm the minister of the Universalist Unitarian Church on English Street. And what we have here are representatives from 4 congregations. And I've been in the business of ministry, if you can call it that, for 10 years. And I've been telling my colleagues that we're in danger of becoming irrelevant. Ministers are, churches are. Everything's become a secular problem because we're not identifying the spiritual roots behind it all. When we can allow 418 people to be chronically homeless and go on as if that was somebody else's problem, there are deep spiritual roots there. What you've exposed us to tonight is how complicated the problem is. It isn't simple, but that is not a reason to give up. That's a reason to engage and get involved. And when you suggested we develop a relationship, I heard you say, with service providers, and I take your point that going out and inviting someone who's in a tent in your backyard to come in and live in your house might not be a good idea. But you start developing relationships with people who are working in the field and really getting an understanding for what the problem is. And I think churches have traditionally been involved with charitable work, and that's important, but we have to be doing the advocacy work as well. We can't be afraid to put the pressure on our politicians, on our governments, and speak up. And as a minister, I don't write often enough to the letters to the editor from trying to bring this point and point out how we're failing as a society when we ignore these problems. So thank you for coming here. This again should be the first, I hope, in the series, because we've learned a lot from you tonight. And I know there are many other service providers and many different angles into this problem, all of which we would benefit from if we knew more. So thank you.
Our pleasure.